I'm Josh Peacock, and this is the Colorist Podcast.
What the colorist brings to the table is not simply matching colors. I always say there's three parts to grading. There is the continuity, of course. There's also fixing problems. But the biggest part of the grade is telling the story, its concept.
On this episode, I talk with Kevin Shaw. Kevin is a veteran 30-year colorist and one of the first trainers at Da Vinci. He is also a founding member and fellow at the Colorist Society International, as well as a trainer at the IKEA. In this interview, we discuss some misconceptions about HDR, how the democratization of color software affects the industry, doing VFX in the color bay, and why the Colorist Society International was formed. Hi, Kevin. Thanks so much for taking the time and joining me on the podcast.
Hey, Josh. Pleasure to be here.
How did you get started as a colorist, and what is your background?
I actually started off as a stills photographer. My degree is in photography, film, and television, but I specialized in photography mainly because the video equipment was pretty rubbish and the film equipment was really expensive to rent. So I was concentrating on stills, and I was doing a lot of exhibition work and my own darkroom printing, color and black and white printing. Well, to cut the story a little bit short, I had a cash flow issue where I couldn't afford more chemicals. Took a job with the moving picture company as a runner, and that was my first introduction to telecine grading. And I got really excited because it was like everything I do in the darkroom, electronic, no chemicals, no cyanide, no bromide, and moving images. Yeah, it didn't get better than that. And then when I started asking around and people said, oh, well, if you want to be an editor, it's 5 years as an assist and blah, blah, blah. And when I talked to the colorist, he sort of said, you kind of just become a colorist. In those days, somebody had to let you loose in a room worth probably a couple of $1 million. And so it was very hard to get your foot in the door. I took this job at the moving picture company as a runner. They didn't have an opportunity for me to go into the telecine department. But after a year there, I did get a job as a colorist assistant, telecine assistant, at a company called Telecine Limited, strangely enough. And that was it. We did mostly music videos. We had the only FDL 60 in London, I think, at that time. And we concentrated on music videos because the commercial crowd were all Syntel. And we would do 2 or 3 music videos a day. And within 3 months, I was grading music videos. I spent about 3 years doing music, and it was fantastic. I mean, what a great way to learn. Everything was experimental.
Right.
And nobody really cared as long as it looked great, and that was it. So I had a great time, and that was my start.
So do you think working in telecine prepared you for the way today's digital formats work?
You mean the cameras?
Yes.
No, I wouldn't say that, actually.
Okay.
I'm not saying... I think the telecine experience was fantastic, was such a great discipline. I'm going to use the word discipline in terms of preparing me as a colorist, but I don't think it really helped with the camera formats. I mean, for me, what really helped with digital camera formats was all the stills experience of actually using cameras and understanding exposure, aperture, depth of field, bokeh. Understanding that is much more useful in terms of understanding digital cameras. But the great thing about starting in telecine is, you remember in those days, just having a separate color corrector was unusual. Most people were grading sticks on the telecine at that time. The thing was that these color correctors were very bespoke and quite expensive. This was really rocket science. There's a fantastic thing on YouTube or somewhere that says this whole conspiracy theory that we didn't land on the moon.
Right.
I don't know whether you've seen it, but
yeah.
It says we couldn't have faked the visual effects. The visual effects to make that happen were much more advanced than actually getting to the moon. Getting to the moon was easy compared to the visual effects that you would have had to create to do that. And so, if you wanted to export a color corrector, for example, from Europe to America or America to Europe, that was of a government level because the computers, they weren't off-the-shelf computers, they were custom hardware. They attracted military level interest. So what happened, getting back to the story, what was great about starting off in telecine in those days was that you might get one new feature a year. And during that year, you would milk it to death. You would learn every single trick you could do with that one new feature until the next one came along. And in my case, after a couple of years, I started having to change companies because my company said, oh, we're not going to spend another $50,000 on another window, or secondaries. What do you need those for? This film should all be right on the film, right? So I would have to change companies to take advantage of the latest technology.
So you had said that there was, not very much time in between when you were a runner and you started actually assisting. And these days, the barrier to entry to become a colorist is really diminishing. We have, obviously, free version of Resolve. Do you think that this democratization of color is a good or a bad thing for the industry?
Well, I have mixed feelings about it. I think overall it is a bad thing. It makes it really difficult, not just to make a living, but it makes it really difficult to apportion the correct amount of respect to what a colorist does. And I'll expand on that later. The good part is that back in the telecine days, when you had to have this very expensive equipment and there was a huge barrier to entry in terms of just getting access to the room, the problem with that is that there were a number of successful colorists, if we can call them that actually were not that good. But they had access to the equipment. And I used to, in my head, I used to think, oh, he's really a very good operator, but he's not really that creative. He's not really a good colorist within the terminology that I would use. And so I think, there's a lot of talk now about, well, anybody can download a free copy of Resolve and call themselves a colorist, and they haven't got the background, they haven't got the theory, not just about grading, but the whole workflow of what we do. But in those days, there was another problem that just somebody could, by virtue of the fact that they had been given access to a room, somebody could make a living, but still not perhaps be the best colorist on the planet. One of the other things I wanted to mention here is that with the shift from hardware to software, there's been an enormous shift of responsibility. So in the telecine workflow, most of the time you were grading prior to the edit, and then the editor really had the responsibility of finishing. This reached a pinnacle in the 90s when people wanted more and more from the grade, and the colorist would have to end up doing 3 or 4 passes of things, and then it would get comped together. And that led to flame artists and compositors calling themselves colorists, because they could do all that comping, and they said, well, hell, why are you giving it to a colorist? Just give it to me and I'll do the grade and the comp.
Right.
And that was really, in my mind, that was the catalyst for the requirement for software grading. That really kicked it off, because we were basically being told, we want to do this, but you can't do it, so I'm going to go somewhere else.
Right. And in the same way, we're being asked to do a lot in the color bay as well, as far as doing sky replacements and softening skin.
So that's my point. We've gone full circle now, and the colorist today is not just doing the sort of things that we were doing as telecine colorists, but very often in a true DI workflow, you are finishing. So you're responsible for the deliverables. You're responsible, as you say, for fixing effects, doing effects, compositing, maybe a little bit of fixing on the editing, matching up the sound. All of these things now often land in the lap of the colorist because it's the last touch. And really that was the reason why Jim and I wanted to start the Colorist Society International, was to try and get people to recognize that, guys, we're not just kind of touching up and giving you a bit of continuity here. We're actually taking on, in the old vernacular, the colorist now is the online edit. We used to have this idea of offline and online editing, and then that kind of disappeared because with nonlinear editors, they just got so good that the offline was the online. But we're kind of back to that now, where you do an edit and then the colorist very often is going back to raw footage and conforming the edit again. And it's effectively, we are the online, I hesitate to use the word editor, but we're finishing. And that is an enormous responsibility.
I know that there's a push, too, for certain titles to not be listed as colorist, but as a finishing artist.
Yeah. There's all sorts of movements for different titles. Eric Whipp had a great credit on Mad Max. I think it was look development or something like that. So people are just trying to be recognized for something in addition to being the colorist. But my feeling is that we just need to raise the profile of what being a digital intermediate colorist really means.
all of these systems too, they all are integrating a lot more of these features too. So, and you've worked on almost all of them, I would say, right? You've worked on Nucoda, Luster, Baselight.
I didn't do very much with Luster, but I know Nucoda and Baselight very well. I have a pretty good grasp of Quantel, Resolve, obviously. I wouldn't say I know all of them, but yeah, I think we owe it to ourselves to know what all the systems do. Even if we don't feel I can operate all of them equally, that doesn't matter. What I need to know is actually that system might be better for that type of job. Like one system might be better for stereoscopic, or another system might be better for compositing. Understanding how they work, one of the things that I teach in the training classes is it's really good to try another system and see what it can do. And then you think, well, I should be doing that on my system, whatever that system is. And it helps you to kind of broaden your horizons and not be blinkered about just because my system doesn't do it, then I don't need to do it. I don't need to learn it. I think we're that now.
Yeah, that was great too. I mean, I had taken your classes as well, and you even said it's great to just go into Photoshop again and start to play around with the color in there as well and see what that's doing and figure out how to do that within your own grading system.
Yeah, I think Photoshop has got a very rich heritage. It's had the benefit of a huge user base. And of course, hundreds and hundreds of developers, which none of the color correctors have that many developers on. And we can definitely learn from it. Absolutely.
I can't recommend your classes enough. Your classes at the IKEA, International Colorist Academy, they're awesome. There is one saying that I will bring up. It says, if you want to learn something, read about it. If you want to understand something, write about it. And if you want to master something, teach it. How has teaching increased your skills as a colorist?
Well, that really was the reason I got into teaching in the first place. I was one of the first, if not the first, freelance trainer. I was hired by Da Vinci. My first training mission actually was to go to Hong Kong. It was a funny story. I just took it really because I wanted to go to Hong Kong. But it turned out very well, and one thing led to another, and Bruce Graham at that time was both product manager and the trainer for Da Vinci Systems. And when he left, David Katt took over as product manager, but said they had a very heavy schedule in terms of new products. They moved to SGI computers. It was quite a lot of work. And he said, well, I can't really do the teaching. Da Vinci has grown so much. I can't really do the teaching and the product management. And they approached me and said, would you like to do it as a freelance thing? And it wasn't really a yes or no question. It was, are you available to do some training? And I would say yes or no. And eventually, in 1998, I was doing so much training for them that they employed me full-time as director of training. But that was really my motivation, is that if you teach, you just have to learn everything. And I was very lucky because I knew exactly who to go to, particularly with the Da Vinci team. I would go to people and say, why does it work like this? Or I don't really understand what that's doing. I can see what it's doing, but I don't really understand it enough to control it. And so I could ask these questions. And if I ran out of questions, I would be teaching a class and I would be flooded with questions, and people would, sometimes it was quite strange because people would say, so why do you do that? Why don't you do this? And I think, the truth is because I didn't think of that.
Yeah.
And you think, so which way is better? Is my way better because I've always done it that way? Or is this better? And sometimes it would be that this way, this other way was something new that I'd never had call to use because I always did it in my own old way. But this way might be a little different. It might be a little better. It might be a little quicker. And so it really kept me on my toes. And to this day, I still get a buzz out of these classes. No two classes are ever the same. It's as much what people bring to the class as what I can offer them. And it's just this sharing of information. It's a fantastic way to further the craft, really.
Yeah. There's one thing that I constantly think about from your classes, too. When I'm coloring, it's the more filtered anything is, whether it's air or water, the less pure that it is. So to get the purest images, we should not over-filter our images. However, what I've noticed with some colorists as well is the approach is a little different. They want to get in there and relight every single element, relight eyes and lips. And the tools have progressed in a way to make that possible. Do you believe there's a place for each of these techniques? And where do you think that they're best used?
Yes, the soft touch. But listen, I'm not saying that you shouldn't relight everything. All I'm saying is that if you're going to relight everything, do it in the simplest, cleanest way. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't make all these changes. I mean, I remember when I was working in Italy, I started a telecine room at a film lab, and I was supposed to teach the old school color timers how to grade in the telecine on a Da Vinci. After my first commercial session, I remember this old Italian guy kind of looking at me, sort of looking up at me from the sofa at the back and saying, "Kevin, is this grading or is it a paint box?"
Yeah.
Because for him it was totally taboo to be using secondaries and shapes and all of these things, because that's not what was shot. And I said, well, it's different now. There are things that you can't do in the camera, either because you don't have time, you don't have the budget, or it's not technically possible, that we do in post, and that's fair. And it's very much my background in stills. You know, the Ansel Adams thing of there are certain things that you do in the exposure and there are certain things you do in the printing. And it's still very much like that. So is there room for both? Absolutely. I know a lot of it comes down to the genre of the grade. I think it's very interesting that in the 30 plus years that I've been grading, the length of time of a grading session has not changed. It has not got shorter because the technology is quicker, and it has not got longer because we do more. And so what that means is that we have to typically do an awful lot more stuff in the same amount of time. And then if you look at it across the genres, you find that, in television, a lot of television in this country, you're expected to knock out between 45 and 60 minutes a day. On a big show, maybe you might get twice that, but a lot of time that's what you're expected to do. Compare that with, say, a feature film where I would expect to do maybe 10 minutes a day. In America, on the bigger features, you might only do 5 minutes a day. And then on a commercial where you might do 60 seconds, that could take the whole day, but certainly 4 hours, what I would say would be the average for that. So it's not that the features guy, or the commercials guy, I should say, is really slow compared to the television guy. But if you're doing that type of work, then there are things that you can and can't do in the time available. So the light touch approach, which I favor, is it doesn't mean, well, don't darken the sky or don't lighten the skin, or, it doesn't mean don't do that. It just means if you can do it with one tool, that's generally better than doing it with 3 layers. To kind of bring this down to real basics, I see a lot of colorists that do everything with 1 or 2 tools. And as a result, they have to use a lot of layers and a lot of keys or shapes or blend modes, but they're always using the same few tools. Whereas my approach tends to be, in the Nucoder, I've got 20 plus tools in each layer, and they're all there for a reason, and they're all good for different things. And by using those, I find that I can have this soft touch and still do everything. And of course, it's much quicker. If I don't have to make 3 layers, and no matter how good your panels are and no matter how quick you are, it's always quicker to do one soft touch than an extensive thing. And of course, there's a lot less to go wrong. There's a lot less to check.
It's interesting too, because I still see a lot of colorists. You were talking about how some of the colorists that were changing over from being film timers, they probably relied on printer points. Do you still see people using those tools? Things that are not necessarily the newest tool that you could use in software, but they're just either used to using it or there's some other reason why that tool is really good to use.
I mean, printer points is an interesting one because people like Peter Doyle, they have a whole grading technique which is built around lab timing and working for film. And they tend to favor printer points. And in my classes, we talk about big brush theory. And the cleanest tool in any system is that printer point, the printer lights. Or it has a raft of names, density, lift in some systems. But an offset is the cleanest thing that you can do because it doesn't stretch the image, doesn't stretch the pixels apart. I mean, I use it as an analysis tool as much as anything else because it really allows you to look at the image from sort of different levels and assess the image rather than what you've done to the image. But yes, people do get stuck in, I mean, equally, I could say that there's an awful lot of colorists that work with lift gamma gain, 3 trackballs. In fact, that's really become the symbol of a color corrector is these 3 trackballs. But those trackballs are heavily based on transferring film to video. It's because film curves have 3 different gamma points according to shadows, midtones, and highlights. And that was why you needed 3 separate controls to get from film into video. But nowadays you see a lot of people, they just jump right on there and they don't use, say, brightness contrast, for example, which is actually a really good way of dealing with images. But it's never occurred to them that there is a difference in the approach. But I think the difference, and I'm not saying one is better than the other, I use both, but back to the soft touch, if you do it with lift, gamma, gain, that's 3 controls. If you can do the same thing with brightness contrast, it's only 2 controls. And I do wonder, if you were to start with a blank sheet of paper, how cool would this be? Imagine a color corrector that wasn't based around 3 trackballs, but it was based around 2 trackballs, because after all, we only have 2 hands. That would be something worth investigating.
Yeah, sure. I mean, when you're modifying the contrast and exposure on a basslight, you're only using those 2 controls as well. So you're only using the left 2 trackballs in that sense, like the 1 wheel and 1 trackball.
Yeah, it tends to work better for contrast and color correction, though, because obviously trying to use a contrast trackball, color RGB trackball, is a bit weird. You add blue to the lights and you automatically get yellow in the shadows.
Do you think that based on that, do you think that there is a tool or a tool set that hasn't been invented yet that still needs to be invented for a color corrector?
Oh, God, yes. I have a book of them, I think. Yes, there's lots of things that have not been done. And I think it's a credit to all of us that, we're still using film tools to deal with digital images, and we're using video tools to use with digital images. It's only very recently that we've started to see what I would call camera raw tools creeping into the color corrector. And you see this in Resolve most recently, but so things like color temperature controls, they've only come sort of begrudgingly almost at the end. I think the next reason for developing new tools is definitely going to be high dynamic range. High dynamic range displays, not capture, obviously.
Right.
Because that really does. And we kind of do have the tools. I mean, we kind of do have the tools. We can modify in Resolve, for example, the, what do they call them? They call them log primaries. And in Nucoda, we have brightness regions. You have an adjustable range on your trackball and master. And you really need that in HDR grading, because it's not as simple as shadows, midtones, and highlights anymore. At the very least, there's 2 or 3 levels of highlight, and I would argue there's probably at least 2 levels of shadow, and yet most of the picture, of course, is in the middle range. So yes, I think there's a lot of tools that could be developed. The difficulty is, and we hold ourselves back, we as colorists tend to be very reluctant to change. I remember in the days of doing DaVinci demos, there were people that just would not even look at the DaVinci. The only reason they would ever look at a DaVinci was to find something wrong that they could criticize and justify why they were using something else. And I think a little bit of that goes on. I think not as much, because there is more variety and people have realized that you can't really make a living just using one system anymore. But I do think that in a way we're our worst enemies. We don't encourage enough development of new features.
On the forums and various places, people have had debates about whether you should be using LUTs that are look products or film emulation in projects. What is your take on it?
Well, I'm a big fan of LUTs. I'm a big fan of anything that helps stretch you. And I don't often use LUTs, in truth, in the grade. But the thing I love about LUTs is it very quickly gets you somewhere. And what I'll often do is reverse engineer the LUT if I like that look. I like to have more control over it. There's some great LUTs out there, and some of them are all just continually surprising. Again, LUTs get a bit of a bad name, I think, for 2 reasons. A LUT is now a common phrase that everybody uses. I still meet a lot of people who really don't quite understand what's going on here. With LUTs, you can always tell whether somebody gets it or not, because they'll say, oh, have you got a Rec 709 LUT? Or have you got a film look LUT? And the thing about LUTs is it's like a timetable. It has to have a start and an end. You can't have a known ending without knowing what the starting point is. And a lot of people miss that. A LUT really is just a lockdown grade. I mean, for about 20 years now, I've had this idea that it's great to build a library of settings, I would call them, But you could equally call them LUTs nowadays in today's parlance. The only difference between, my settings and a LUT is that the settings are easier to go in and manipulate, whereas the LUT is pretty difficult. There's only so much you can do with a LUT, although of course you can grade before it and after it. Actually, that's where power grade came from. It's become a little bit tarnished in its current form because the origin of it has been lost. The origin of power grade was that in most systems, the only exception I can think of is Apple Color. In most systems, when you save a memory or whatever it's called in your system, you save everything, and then when you recall it, you filter back the bits that you want, again, depending on the system. The idea of power grade was that when you save the memory in this very special place, you actually choose the bits that are relevant. And the idea is that you can use those settings again and again. A simple example might be a highlight key with defocus and a little bit of lift or brightness in it to give you a highlight glow. So that setting is something you might use over and over again. And so if you could save it where it only remembered the key, the brightness, and the defocus, that would save you having to filter out all the other stuff. Even if everything else is neutral, that would save you having to filter out all the other stuff, and it would just append on top. And remember, this is dating back to the days of telecine. It's much, much easier to do it in software. But that's kind of been lost, and you still have to kind of do a little bit of mental arithmetic to make your memories work that way nowadays. But I do that a lot. I mean, at one point, I had hundreds of these things, even something like bleach bypass. I might have 10 bleach bypass settings, let's call them. And the great thing about it was that a client could come in and say, I think I want it to be bleach bypass. And then instead of me having to kind of grade it, set it up, make it look nice, have a discussion about it, in the time it takes to even ask him a question, I can say, okay, let's try these. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. None of them would be perfect. I wouldn't expect any of them to be perfect. But 1 or 2 of them are going to be better than all of the others. And the great thing about this is not only does it kind of visually get you there very, very quickly, so you're not investing your own emotional time in the grade, but also you avoid any sort of confrontation with the client. Because the client can say, no, I don't really like any of those. And you can say, okay, well, let's try something else. Because what you've shown him is bleach bypass. Maybe that's not, he asked for that, but that may be not what he really wants. It may just have been that in his head, bleach bypass looked a little bit different. But I haven't said to him, oh, well, you asked for bleach bypass and that's it. I'm giving you bleach bypass. And he hasn't said to me, you don't know how to do bleach bypass, because I've just recalled a calibrated setting. And it doesn't really matter how the calibration can be debatable, but it's a preset and it gets you there very, very quickly and it helps you find the right path. And I think that's really important. And for me, that's the best thing about LUTs. And occasionally, yes, occasionally a LUT will do something that is very hard to manage throughout a project, and then I will use the LUT.
But the idea is still that you want to separate a grade, your initial grade, from the look, so that you have the flexibility to do all of those things.
That's my style. I call it the natural color and the false color. The natural color is nothing to do with how it should look. It's not even always to do with how it's shot. The natural color is how much of the original scene information can I extract from the source material. And then by neutralizing that, then I can use these LUTs, settings, presets on top. And even if I create a new one just for that job, which is usually what happens, of course, it means that I can apply it universally across a number of scenes within one location or sometimes a whole project in the case of commercial.
At the core, we are all artists that work on these systems, but we're also considered technicians to some degree. Why do you think it's important to understand the science behind grading and not just be an artist?
As telecine colorists, we were very much the bridge from production to post-production. So we were very much the only people that really had to have a good grasp of what happened on set and a really good grasp of what was required by post-production. And that hasn't changed. If anything, it's become even more intense because now we're dealing with source material, so we have to understand what happened on set. Why? Well, because if you understand why this scene is darker than that scene, then again, it goes back to soft touch. You know which tool will best fix that with one tool and not have to do 3 layers to make them match. But equally, we have to know everything about post-production. And in my opinion, the colorist, other than that he doesn't have time to do it, is effectively the post-production supervisor, or certainly working very closely with visual effects but also audio, sound. And because we are influenced by everything else within the project, everything from cinematography, directing, editing, sound, visual effects, distribution, all of those things land on our desk. And so you can't just bluff your way through. I know there are people who are just creatives and don't deal with the rest of it. Either they have assistants or they have another department, or, they deliver something and it goes to somebody else. But increasingly in the modern world, I don't see there's much place for those people, unfortunately.
I think also knowing what's under the hood probably helps you understand why things are doing what they're doing as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it definitely, if you understand, I like to understand what a tool is really doing. I've had this theory, I think since I started, I've had this theory that the label on a control is usually less than useful. And in fact, very often the label on the control might put you off using it at all. Like if you're working on digital camera footage and you're all about new looks and something completely new that nobody's ever seen before, and you see a control that says printerlized and you think, my God, that's like 100 years old. That might put you off. That might not be an exciting tool to you. And yet it is a very exciting tool if you understand what's good about it. Yeah, I'm a great believer that color theory and psychology and you know what, even if you're a musician, even if you don't have any color theory, but you know a lot about musical theory, it's all useful. That's what I love about this job. Everything is inspiration.
So for a while there was a black and white image floating around the internet that got colorized by a computer, surprisingly well. And then after that, there was some debates that at some point, will a computer ever take the place of a colorist?
Honestly, people have been saying that ever since I started. When I started out, people said, why do you want to be a colorist? Film is dead, and here we still are. And can a machine replace a colorist? I mean, I guess there are things that machines could do. But people forget, the whole reason why we have colorists is because we do something the machines cannot do. And so, for example, if you want a standard dynamic range image to high dynamic range, there is no algorithm that can do that for you because it requires a very deep understanding of triggering psychological triggers to create effects. And you just can't do that. It's instinctive. In the same way that could a computer paint? Well, it could. And those paintings might well sell, but it wouldn't replace all the other artists. And I think that's true of color correction. As well as I do, if people could automate color correction and skip it altogether, they would. Absolutely in a heartbeat. And there are, sometimes quite good matching algorithms. And certainly there are lots that take you from raw to something presentable. But is that a replacement for a creative colorist? Absolutely not. This is the thing that's really not understood very well. What the colorist brings to the table is not simply matching colors. You've been to my classes, so you know that I always say there's 3 parts to grading. There is the continuity, of course. There's also fixing problems, of course, some of which we may introduce as part of the look and so on. But the biggest part of the grade is telling the story, its concept. When somebody says to me, okay, let's start, the first thing I want to know is not what they want it to look like. I want to know what the concept is. What are we trying to create in an audience? Are we trying to scare them? Are we trying to make them happy? Are we trying to sell them something? Do I want them to like this guy and not that guy? Do I want them to feel a little bit ambivalent? All of that has to be done in the grading. It should exist from everything else as well, but we have to make sure that the audience get that. And I think that's really what separates us from everybody else in production and post-production. Everybody else is interested in creating something. Our job as colorists is to make sure that the audience get what everybody else has been doing. And I think that's why we're not ever going to be replaced by machines. Machines may make our work easier. And certainly, going from HDR down to lower brightnesses, all the way down to 100 nits, I think that can be automated a great deal, but not the other way around. And interestingly, very few people are grading HDR and then working down to lower brightness levels, because the main deliverable today is still 100 nits or 48 nits in the cinema or whatever. And so people are still focusing on that and then doing a tweak up to HDR. And so we haven't really even started to explore this whole new world of high dynamic range displays.
The first time that I saw an HDR image was at one of the NABs, I think maybe 2014 or 15. I noticed a similarity in the marketing in terms of how stereoscopic was marketed. So there was a lot of, look what this can do. Stereoscopic, when it came out, there was a lot of like poke you in the eye effects. And so with HDR, there was, look at how bright these images can be. Here's fire that's off the charts in terms of nits. But do you think that there's a danger to having the ability to make extremely bright images with this technology? Or with HDR, do you think that creatively it's going to change the way that you work?
I believe wholeheartedly that it is completely going to change the way that we work. And again, we are our worst enemies because there is a reluctance, not entirely our fault. We have to cater to the clients, of course, but we are our worst enemies here because we're doing it all wrong and we're not getting it. And to talk about brightness for HDR is really to miss the big picture. That's the most obvious thing, of course. That's the thing that you see first of all. I've seen posts on forums that talk about, all this talk about extra blacks and stuff, that's all rubbish because the black level doesn't actually change. And again, I'm thinking, you've really missed the point. Totally missed the point. And it gets mixed up with other stuff. It gets mixed up with 4K, but you don't need 4K to do HDR. It gets mixed up with wide color gamut, but you don't even need, I know P3 is part of UHD Premium, but actually, even if you stuck to a Rec 709 color gamut, but you had more nits, the color gamut hasn't changed. But the color volume could double or triple quite easily. And those are usable colors. There's a lot of criticism about wide color gamut, about Rec 2020, because a lot of those colors we don't see them very often. But color volume, that's something we see all the time. And you talked about fire, for example. Fire was actually the first thing that really made me understand high dynamic range. It's not that the fire is brighter. It's that the fire is brighter and it's not clipped. We've never seen that. And the thing that people always do, you ask somebody to go out and shoot high dynamic range to demonstrate on a monitor and they go and shoot a sunset or something. That's nuts because you can't capture the sun. It's still fake. It's still being converted. The real beauty of high dynamic range is all those colors that exist at very bright levels. Remember, color gamut is chromaticity. It doesn't talk about brightness. Fire is the thing that brought it home to me because I was working on a job where actually all the flame was captured. And but in a normal grade, you could either make it have all the detail, but make it quite muddy, or you made it bright, and of course it clipped. But you do that in high dynamic range, and you get the brightness and the color. Same thing with, stained glass windows is another really easy one to grasp, because in an RGB system at 100 nits, if you want the color, you have to drop the brightness. Because the only way you can get 100 nits out of your system is if the red, green, and blue channels are all at maximum, and then there's no color, it's white. For me, the big thing, and this came home to me at NAB 2016, where I saw a lot of HDR. I saw the Christie demonstration. I was at the AMC Theater, where they did 4 sort of short previews of different films, and then they showed Batman vs. Superman. You could actually almost see the evolution of HDR grading. For me, the great thing about HDR is that you now have variable black and variable white. So let's say you're on a sunny out day scene. You might not want the brightness to go too high because you want to see detail in the sky and things without it being distracting. But what you can do is you can raise the black level so it's actually not black. It could incidentally still be darker than traditional cinema, if we're talking about cinema, but in the home it will just be brighter. So there's some research that suggests that the visual range of the human eye is actually only about 100 nits. But where we differ from a display is our eye is continually ranging that 100 nits up and down the scale. Now, as colorists, one of the ways to look at what we do is we do that ranging in the grade so that everything is at 100 nits. But when you're working with high dynamic range, you don't want to use all of the range at once. But what you might do is you might say, well, the outside scene, the blacks are up a little bit, the colors are more bright and more saturated. And then imagine you go inside or you go into a cave. Well, of course, the brightness drops down, but you can now drop your black level because you lifted the black level for the outside scene. And nobody will know because the dynamic range is still more than 100 nits. But then you go inside and now everything's dark. And in these laser theaters, it really goes dark. I mean, you can't see your hand in front of your face.
Wow.
And that's really an experience that needs to be exploited.
Right. Yeah, nobody really talks about that, about the scenes being next to each other in that way. And that's really important.
And it's really important. And we've actually had to face it. I mean, I don't like the analogy with stereoscopic, because stereoscopic was a kind of a bit of a gimmick that nobody really wanted. It was kind of forced on us. And I have to say this too, and this is my opinion only, but HDR will be forced on us in the same way that 4K is forced on us. And it's nothing to do with entertainment. 4K screens are forced on us. We all know that there's no real benefit in a 4K screen. But the reason why we've got 4K screens is because computers need more real estate. They want more windows on the screen at one time, and so they need more pixels. And so that's what they're making, and we have to use those screens. We're not a big enough industry to demand our own display devices. And the same is true with HDR. Why HDR will not ever go away is because you need HDR on your phone. Not to watch the latest blockbuster movie in HDR, but because without that extra brightness, it's really hard to read your display in a sunny day. But if you had that super bright screen, you could read it in daylight. Got to solve the energy problems, of course, but still, I believe that HDR won't go away. And in fact, there's an awful lot of screens on the market that are saying I don't think they're actually using the term HDR, but they're saying, we're 300 nits. Because they've always been 300 nits. It's only us in our industry that have said, well, our standard is 100 nits. So for me, HDR is coming, and it's incredibly exciting for us as colorists because everything can be remastered to take advantage of it. There's a debate as to whether you should, but still, there's a lot of new tricks. There's a lot of really cool stuff, not just with new material, but with old material as well. I've had a look at a lot of old television work or not so much old, but, existing television series and music videos and features. And there's just so much we can do with HDR. I mean, that is a new toolkit right there. That's what we should be embracing.
So the last question I actually wanted to ask you is regarding the Colorist Society International, which you launched last April. So a brief description, what is the CSI and why was it created?
It was created because every colorist I've ever spoken to has said, why do we get our credits after the tea lady, after the animal trainers? Why are we the very last people on screen? Why aren't we taken more seriously? Why don't we get the sort of recognition? Given that you get visual effects people and accountants, stunt people who all contribute. I'm not saying they don't contribute to the film. They all contribute a lot to the film. But we are one of that rare part of the team that has been through every single frame of that project. So why don't we get better recognition? Somebody summed it up a little while back, and it was really a pivotal point in creating Colorist Society International. If you are not represented, you're not recognized. And the only reason we're not represented is we're all got too busy to actually get together and work this out. And so we felt that somebody just needs to push the ball, get the ball rolling, and see if we can get some traction. And we need to present ourselves in a dignified, unified way. Interestingly, since we did that, it's not just the colorists that have recognized how great an idea that is, but it's the manufacturers, it's the press. I mean, people phoning us up literally every day. I mean, Jim and I are so completely overwhelmed by the amount of work that this has introduced, and we're loving it. We're absolutely loving it. And I apologize right now to anybody that's waiting for a response from us. But, this is big. This is probably the biggest thing that we could have done. And it's very exciting, and I think it will have a long-term effect on colorists, color correction, and our part in the industry.
So why did you think it took so long for this to happen? I know that this idea had been battered around for many years. People didn't have the investment of time, or it wasn't as important, or we weren't involved as much in the process. Was it the combination of all those things of why this is the tipping point for this to happen?
Certainly there are a lot of variables at play that make this the right time. Like all inventions, everything comes together at the right time. It had been tried before. I think one of the problems with previous attempts were too many people not getting anything done, not coming to an agreement. And there were a lot of questions asked in forums and things that were really sort of treading the ground softly to see what was going to happen. And it was quite clear that if you waited for a unified agreement on anything, you would never get anything done. And so Jim and I decided that we need to build an architecture as a small two-man team, although we may well have to expand that fairly soon. But it needed to be small just to get that momentum, just to get it off the ground. That was one reason. The second reason was that it's only recently that there have been enough colorists, full-time professional colorists, to have the presence, to have just the sheer numbers to make this worthwhile. At NAB, Peter Chamberlain from Blackmagic told me that there are now over 2 million seats of Resolve out there. That's a voice that needs to be represented. Back when I was director of training at Da Vinci, I think I would put the total number of colorists in the world at somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000. That's, spread right around the world. That would be quite hard to bring those people together in a meaningful way. But there's a lot of us now. The work that we do is not just television. It's film, it's television, it's internet, it's corporate. We touch a much wider part of the universe, and so that's really important. So numbers are important. I think what we do, as I've said several times in this interview, what we do now is we have almost ultimate responsibility. The buck stops on the colorist desk very often. Not always. There's still a certain amount of material that goes back to the editor, but increasingly it's being finished in the grading. They're doing DCPs or they're doing television DPPs in Europe. We're doing multiple deliverables, and the colorist is having to do at least advising, technical advising. I can't tell you how many jobs come to me still and don't know what color space they want to be delivering. They just don't know. And so our job is not to kind of beat them up and say, oh, well, I can't, how can I do this if you don't tell me what you want? No, our job is to take care of that for them. And so I do believe that we have increased responsibility that we didn't have before. In the days of telecine grading, we did a great job, but we gave it to somebody else. And anything we couldn't do, somebody else picked up the pieces. Now we're the one picking up the pieces. And I think that needs to be recognized. So for me, that's the main reason why we need to do it now. To be honest, the Academy was started to build up cinematographers. They did exactly what we've done. If you take it back even further, if you go back to Renaissance art, the artists formed alliances and said, we are not just being employed as painters. We are going to create something and then sell it. That was a pivotal turning point when artists, painters, would stop taking commissions and paint what they were told to paint and go out and paint what they wanted to paint and then try and sell it. Now, I'm not saying that we colorists are going to go out and produce movies, but what I am saying is there is a very significant change in the responsibility of what we do on projects. And anybody that's not taking advantage of that is missing out. But at the same time, we need to get the message across. We need to educate people so they realize that that is actually what we're doing. That is our job. It's not just changing the colors on something.
I applaud all of the progress that you've made so far on it. You and Jim have taken it a very long way.
And it's just the beginning. It's such a thrill. It was great that IMDb have now recognized Colorist Society International. This is just the start. We're still pushing for an award ceremony. I can't talk too much about what we're doing, so I don't want to make promises that may take time to deliver on,
Sure.
But the momentum is huge. As I say, it's really exciting for all of us.
Thank you very much for joining me. It's been great. So how can people see your work or get in contact with you?
I still have my website, finalcolor.com. That's where I keep my work and both gradings and also articles. They can also keep up with what's going on the International Colorist Academy website, which is icolorist.com. Of course, the Colorist Society International, I urge everybody who is a full-time colorist or who wishes to support full-time colorists, we have categories for both, to join Colorist Society International, and there are forums there. In fact, full members of Colorist Society International have access to the member directory. So in other words, as a member, you have access to all the other members, and there's some pretty prestigious people in there already. So that's another way. And then I just started work at Final Frame in London, where we're setting up 3 grading rooms. One is a projection room, one is a Dolby PRM for television, and one is a restoration room. And so anybody who wants a colorist in London, Final Frame is the place to come.
Excellent. Thanks again, Kevin.
Thank you, Josh.
And that's the Colorist Podcast. Visit us on the web at www.coloristpodcast.com, on Twitter at Colorist Podcast, on Facebook at www.facebook.com/coloristpodcast. Give us a review in iTunes and mention who